Hey, so sometimes I get questions when a new version of the engine gets released and students have a difficult time upgrading their projects or starting maybe even new projects because they get certain errors, workloads are missing and so forth. So I'll just step you through some of the steps that you can take to try and avoid some of those issues. I have covered some of this before, but I'll try and emphasize certain things for you in this video. To demonstrate how you may go about upgrading a project, so in other words converting a project of a previous engine version to a new engine version, and some of the issues that can pop up along the way, I will create some project in Unreal Engine 5.0 and then attempt to convert that project to 5.1. You can follow along if you want. With the launcher open, I will go to the Unreal Engine library and we can see that I have two versions of the engine installed, 5.0 and 5.1. I will launch 5.0. I will create some game project, making sure to select C++, give it some name and then click Create. Back in the launcher in the Unreal Engine library, let's launch Unreal Engine 5.1. Notice that a small engine version number appears at the bottom of the specific project. These are 5.0 projects, so we can double-click to open the project in the currently running engine version. Of course, we can click on it once and then click on Open. Now we get this Convert Project dialog. Typically, you want to select Open a copy, since the conversion will rebuild your code projects. New features often mean API changes, which may require you to modify your game-specific code before it may compile successfully in the new version of the engine. The Open a Copy option will create a copy of the project for opening in the new version of the engine, and as such we are basically left with a backup of the older version, and this is great since we don't have to now manually create a backup when we want to convert to a new version of the engine. Although you should still keep proper backups of your projects on an external drive or on the cloud, whatever servers you choose to use for that. I may discuss Git and version control at some point in the future as well. You do have some additional options, but I recommend the Open a Copy option. Click that. Back in the editor, we want to refresh the project now. Then we can open the IDE. You may notice this warning that reads, based on your solution, you might need to install extra components for a full development experience. Basically, Visual Studio has detected that some components are missing. If we click on Install, we get the Visual Studio installer. From here, notice these workloads are selected and we can install them from here. As I've demonstrated before, we can also install those and individual components by going to Tools and then selecting Get Tools and Features. One issue that you might run into is when you switch to a different IDE, such as Visual Studio 2019 to Visual Studio 2022, then it may actually open up the older version, so the previous version of the IDE, whatever IDE you had selected. For example, if we go to Tools and then select to open Visual Studio 2022, Visual Studio 2019 actually opens up, and that is not what we want. Close that off. We can regenerate the project files to fix this issue. So once you have changed your source code editor in the editor preferences, you want to go to Tools and select to refresh the Visual Studio project. That will update the code project and generate some project files. Now if we go to Tools and select to open up Visual Studio 2022, it will open the solution in the correct version of Visual Studio, in this case 2022. Let's look at this again. In the editor preferences, navigate to the source code section, and then we can change the source code editor from Visual Studio 2019 to 2022. A restart is required to apply the settings, so we will select Restart Now. Back in the editor, if we go to Tools, open Visual Studio 2022, it may open 2019 instead, which again is not what we want. To show you a different way of regenerating those project files, we can go to the project folder, right-click on the U project and select Generate Visual Studio Project Files. That is similar to the option I showed you before, refresh Visual Studio 2020 project in the Tools menu. Now if we select to open Visual Studio from the Tools menu, it will open the solution in the correct version of Visual Studio. Finally, if you are still having issues, you can refresh the project manually by regenerating derived folders. Remember how we get to the project location? Well, from the launcher in the Unreal Engine library, we can right-click on the particular project and select Show in Folder. Next, let's select the .vs, binaries, derived data cache, intermediate and saved folders. That is, holding down Ctrl and clicking the ones I want to select. I will also select the Visual Studio solution, so that .sln file and the .vsconfig file, since we can regenerate those. Now for the scary part, I will press delete. This is all we are left with now. Of course, we don't want to delete the Unreal project file nor the source code, since we can't simply regenerate those. Next, double-click on the uProject file to run the project. Now we get this missing project modules dialog. It reads, the following modules are missing or built with a different engine version, followed by the name of the project, and would you like to rebuild them now? Select yes to rebuild. You will notice some of these folders reappear now. Of course, you can right-click to refresh if they don't. At this point, if we navigate to the C++ classes for the project in the content browser and double-click on a C++ class, we get this could not find code file.sln, so the solution file. Remember that we have deleted the Visual Studio Solution file previously, but we can regenerate that in a couple of ways. Firstly, by going to the project file, we can right-click on the uProject and select to generate Visual Studio project files. And we can also generate those from within the editor by going to Tools and generate Visual Studio Project. So I will click that. Now if we bring up the project folder, notice that the .vs folder and the solution file gets generated. Just to demonstrate, I will delete the solution file again, right-click on uProject and select Generate Visual Studio Project Files. That will generate the solution file. Now we can open the solution file from the project folder or from within the editor by going to Tools and then selecting Open Visual Studio. Also, if we click on the C++ class in the content browser now, then that will open in Visual Studio. Again, please check out the Setting up Visual Studio page for IDE compatibility and also the workload and component requirements. That is, for the particular version of the engine, make sure to select the specific engine version in the documentation. For example, I will go back to the version 5.0. With 5.0, notice that we only really need this game development with C++ workload. However, switching back to the documentation for Unreal Engine version 5.1, this version of the engine requires additional workloads. There is also this documentation updating projects to newer versions of Unreal Engine. With a warning here, after you update a project to a newer version of Unreal Engine, you will not be able to open it in an older version of the engine. And as a best practice, we always recommend converting a copy of the project by following these steps, since we can always delete the older version of the project. Okay, the steps are outlined here, and it describes the different options that you have available. With the launcher open, we can go to the News tab, and in here you should see a section that talks about the new version of the engine. So here Unreal Engine 5.1 is now available, so I can click that, and you can also click on the forums. So 5.1 is now available. The page will document the release highlights, but you can also go to the release notes in the documentation. Typically that is located at the bottom of the page. So click on that, and we have the 5.1 release notes. It's quite an extensive list typically. Then in the forums, I clicked that link to the forums previously, so you can go to announcements. We can click on announcements, And then typically you will have a post on the preview version of the engine and also a released version of the engine as well. So just a couple of places where you can get more information on a particular release. Alright, to wrap up this video, you can also avoid some compilation issues when updating your project, so converting your project to a newer version of the engine by avoiding IDE plugins and extensions. And you should also avoid components with experimental features. They may sound cool and helpful at first, but from my experience, plugins and extensions cause compilation issues more often than not. So I just use the recommended IDE and workloads and components, so the bare bones IDE basically. Alright, so with this we are going to wrap up this lecture. I hope you found it useful and that it will help you solve some of those issues when you update your project. Please follow the steps that I've demonstrated before you post in the comments, or that you post in the forums, on the Unreal Engine forums for example, or something like that, because I will most likely recommend some of these steps anyway. Alright, see you next time.